Hello, dear listeners. If you enjoy bedtime stories that linger in your mind long after the lights go out, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. Your support helps bring more haunting tales to life here on Blue Flame. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let the shadows speak. Childhood nightmare follows me. It was the autumn of 2007 in the quiet town of Wexford, Pennsylvania, a place where the trees blazed crimson and gold, and the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. The kind of town where everyone knew your name, your parents, and sometimes your secrets. I was 10 years old then, small for my age, with knobby knees and a habit of chewing the inside of my cheek when nervous. My name is Eloan, a name my mother borrowed from an old Cornish tale meaning elm tree. She thought it sounded poetic. Most kids at school thought it sounded strange. But strangeness, I would soon learn, was the least of my worries. Our house stood at the end of Hemlock Lane, a narrow road that curved like a question mark through the woods. It was a modest two-story home with peeling white paint, a wraparound porch that creaked with every step, and a basement door that never quite latched right. My room faced east, so every morning, pale sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, painting stripes across my quilt. But it was the nights that haunted me, the deep, velvet black nights when the wind whispered through the pines like a voice just beyond understanding. The nightmare began on a Thursday. I remember because it was the night before parent-teacher conferences, and I'd been anxious all day. That evening, after a dinner of meatloaf and overcooked carrots, I climbed into bed with a dog-eared copy of Where the Wild Things Are. My mother kissed my forehead, tucked the blanket under my chin, and turned off the lamp. "Sleep tight, little elm," she murmured, closing the door softly behind her. At first, the dream felt ordinary, a forest tall and shadowed, with roots that curled like sleeping serpents beneath my bare feet. But then I heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against glass. I turned, heart hammering, and saw a figure standing between two oaks. It was tall, too tall, its limbs elongated like taffy pulled thin. Its face, there was no face. Just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over a skull that seemed slightly too narrow. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It simply watched. I woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the digital clock on my nightstand reading 2:17 a.m. My window was open just a crack, though I swore I'd closed it before bed. A cold draft snaked across the floorboards, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent of rain. I pulled the covers over my head and didn't sleep again that night. The next evening, the same dream returned. This time, the figure was closer, close enough that I could see the way its fingers twitched, as if resisting the urge to reach for me. And this time, it made a sound, a wet, clicking noise deep in its throat, like a tongue peeling away from the roof of a dry mouth. I told my parents the next morning, voice trembling over breakfast cereal. My father chuckled, ruffling my hair. "Just a bad dream, kiddo. You've been watching too many spooky cartoons." My mother frowned, but said nothing. Still, that night she left my hallway light on. But the light didn't help. Night after night, the figure drew nearer. By the end of the week, it stood at the edge of the dream forest, one skeletal hand resting on a tree trunk, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. And then, on the seventh night, it spoke. Not with words, but with images. In my mind, I saw our house. Not as it was, but as it would be. Windows shattered, porch sagging, paint bleached by years of sun and neglect. I saw myself older, standing in the driveway, suitcase in hand, looking back one last time before walking away. And beneath it all, a feeling, not fear, but sorrow. A deep, aching loneliness that clung to my ribs like ivy. I woke screaming. My parents rushed in, my father flipping on the overhead light, my mother gathering me into her arms. I babbled about the faceless thing, the forest, the vision of our ruined home. This time, they didn't dismiss me. My father checked the locks. My mother brewed chamomile tea and sat with me until dawn painted the sky in soft lavender. For weeks, the dreams stopped. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be for a child who now flinched at shadows and refused to sleep with the closet door open. I made friends again. I laughed during recess. I even forgot, for a little while, the chill that had coiled in my stomach every time I passed the woods behind our house. But nightmares, I've learned, are patient. They wait. They remember. And sometimes, they follow you into adulthood. Now, I'm 28. I live in a third-floor apartment in Pittsburgh, far from Hemlock Lane and its whispering pines. I have a job editing technical manuals, a cat named Juniper, and a therapist who says my recurrent nocturnal disturbances are likely tied to childhood anxiety. And yet, last Tuesday, just past midnight, I woke to the sound of tapping. Not on glass. On wood. Soft, deliberate, like someone gently rapping their knuckles against my bedroom door. I lay frozen, breath caught in my throat, listening. The sound didn't repeat. But when I finally mustered the courage to check the hallway, I found something on the floor. A single dry elm leaf, curled at the edges, though it's been years since I've walked beneath an elm tree. I haven't slept through the night since. Sometimes, I wonder if it was ever just a dream. Maybe the figure wasn't born in my mind, but invited in, through an open window, a crack in the foundation, a moment of childhood vulnerability. Maybe it never left. Maybe it's been waiting all this time, biding its time until I was old enough to understand what it was trying to show me. Or maybe it's just lonely. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the nightmare didn't end when I grew up. It grew up with me. And now, as I sit here in the dim glow of my desk lamp, typing these words with trembling fingers, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the silence between heartbeats, it's watching again. Not in the woods. Not in my dreams. But here. Waiting for me to close my eyes. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and jumpy mornings. I started locking my bedroom door, not just at night, but during the day too, as if daylight alone could keep something out that had already found its way in. Juniper, my cat, seemed to sense the shift in me. She stopped curling up on my lap while I worked and instead perched on the windowsill, ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. I tried rationalizing it. Maybe the leaf had blown in through a crack in the window frame. Maybe I'd tracked it in on my shoes without realizing. But deep down, I knew better. That leaf wasn't just any leaf. It was from an American elm, a tree nearly wiped out by Dutch elm disease decades ago. There hadn't been one within miles of my apartment. Still, I refused to give in to panic. I doubled my therapy sessions, practiced grounding techniques, even bought a white noise machine to drown out the silence that now felt too loud. For a while it worked. The tapping didn't return. The dream stayed away. I began to believe, foolishly, that I'd outrun it. Then came the rainstorm. It was late October, the kind of storm that rolled in fast and furious, rattling the fire escapes and turning the streets into rivers. Thunder cracked like splitting bone, and lightning lit up my room in stark, stuttering flashes. I was halfway through a cup of chamomile tea when the power went out. Darkness swallowed the apartment whole. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. As the screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow across the walls, I heard it again, the tapping. Not on the door this time. On the window. Slow. Deliberate. 3 soft knocks, then a pause, then 2 more. My breath hitched. I didn't move. Didn't blink. The rain drummed against the glass, but beneath it, that sound persisted, steady, patient, unmistakable. Juniper let out a low, guttural hiss and bolted under the bed. I forced myself to look. At first, There was nothing but the distorted reflection of my own wide eyes in the rain-streaked pane. Then, between two lightning strikes, I saw it, a silhouette pressed against the outside of the glass. So thin, limbs bent at angles that shouldn't be possible. And though the face was obscured by shadow and water, I felt its gaze like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I stumbled backward, knocking over my teacup. It shattered on the hardwood floor, but I barely noticed. My pulse roared in my ears as I scrambled for the deadbolt, yanking the curtains shut with shaking hands. I pressed my back against the wall, phone clutched to my chest like a talisman, and waited. The tapping stopped. But the feeling didn't. For hours, I sat in the dark, listening to every creak of the building, every drip of the leaky faucet in the kitchen. When the power finally returned just before dawn, I crept to the window and peeled back the curtain with one trembling finger. The street below was empty. Rain pooled in the potholes, reflecting the gray morning light. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the smear on the glass. Not a handprint, too elongated, too narrow, but a streak of something dark and damp, trailing downward from where a face might have pressed against the pane. I touched it with the tip of my gloveless finger. It was cold. Not wet like rain, but slick, almost oily. I cleaned it off immediately, scrubbing until my knuckles turned red. But no matter how hard I rubbed, I couldn't shake the certainty that it had left something behind. Not on the glass, but inside me. A seed of dread that had taken root long ago and was now blooming in full, suffocating color. I called in sick to work that day. Spent the afternoon researching everything I could about Wexford, about our old house, about the woods behind Hemlock Lane. I dug through archived newspaper clippings, property records, even local folklore. Most of it was mundane. School board meetings, zoning disputes, a missing dog reported in 2006. But then I found it. A brief article from the Wexford Gazette, dated November 3, 2007. Just 3 paragraphs tucked between a bake sale announcement and a report on deer sightings. It mentioned a transient man found deceased in the woods near Hemlock Lane. Cause of death, undetermined. No identification. Only a note in his pocket, written on a scrap of grocery bag, that read, "It watches from the trees." My blood ran cold. That was the week my nightmares began. I scrolled frantically, searching for more, but there was nothing else. No follow-up. No name. Just that one cryptic line, buried in the paper like an afterthought. Was it coincidence? Or had something, or someone, been drawn to those woods long before I ever set foot in them? That night, I dreamed again. But this time, I wasn't in the forest. I was standing in the basement of our old house, the one with the faulty latch, the one I'd avoided as a child because the air down there always smelled like wet earth and rust. The single bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across concrete walls lined with cobwebbed shelves. And there, in the far corner, sat a wooden chair. Empty. But the rope hanging from the ceiling above it swayed gently, as if someone had just stepped off. I woke with a gasp, tears streaming down my face, the taste of copper sharp on my tongue. I hadn't bitten my cheek, I hadn't moved at all. And yet, the metallic tang remained, thick and real. The next morning, I booked a train ticket to Wexford. I hadn't been back since we moved away in 2009, after my parents' divorce. The house had been sold, then resold, then abandoned when the last owner defaulted on taxes. According to county records, it had stood empty for nearly a decade. I arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, the sky heavy with unshed rain. The town looked smaller than I remembered. Narrower streets, fewer cars, more silence. Hemlock Lane was overgrown, weeds pushing through cracks in the asphalt. Our old mailbox lay on its side, rusted and dented. The house. It was worse than in my dream. Paint peeled in long, leathery strips. Shutters hung crooked on broken hinges. The porch sagged so badly I feared it would collapse under my weight. But the front door, oddly, was slightly ajar. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed to turn back. But something deeper, older, pulled me forward. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Floorboards groaned beneath my boots. The wallpaper curled away from the walls like dead skin. I moved slowly, heart pounding, past the living room where my father used to read the paper, past the kitchen where my mother burned toast every Sunday morning. Then I reached the basement door. It stood open, not just unlatched, wide open, as if someone had flung it aside in haste. A cold draft rose from the darkness below, carrying that same scent I remembered from childhood: wet earth, rust, and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and descended. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing the same shelves, the same water-stained ceiling, the same chair in the corner. But now, carved into the concrete floor beneath it, was a symbol I didn't recognize. A circle with 3 intersecting lines, like a twisted sun. And beside it, half buried in dust, lay a small, leather-bound journal. My hands shook as I picked it up. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting was eerily familiar. Not mine, but close, as if written by someone who knew the shape of my thoughts. The first entry was dated October 29, 2007. "I see it in the trees," it read. "It doesn't blink. It doesn't breathe. But it knows my name. I think it's been here longer than the house. Longer than the town. It waits for children who listen too closely to the wind." I flipped through the pages, each one more frantic than the last. Sketches of the faceless figure. Notes about dreams overlapping with waking life. A desperate plea: "If you find this, don't sleep in this house. Don't look at the trees at night. It follows the ones it chooses." The final entry was just 2 words, scrawled in shaky script. "It's Aloan." My name. Not a warning. A recognition. I dropped the journal like it had burned me. Staggered back up the stairs, lungs burning, vision swimming. I didn't stop running until I reached the train station, clutching my coat around me like armor. Back in Pittsburgh, I tried to forget. I threw away the journal, blocked the memories, told myself it was grief, trauma, imagination run wild. But last night, as I lay awake at 2:17 a.m., the same time I'd first woken all those years ago, I heard Juniper growl softly from the foot of the bed. I turned my head slowly. There, in the space between my dresser and the wall, stood the figure. Not in a dream. Not outside a window. In my room. Its head tilted. Its smooth face unreadable. And though it made no sound, I understood, with chilling clarity, what it wanted. It wasn't hunting me. It was reminding me of the promise I never made but somehow broke. Of the truth buried beneath roots and memory. Of the fact that some nightmares aren't meant to be escaped, but carried. Because they're not yours alone. They belong to the place. To the land. To the silence between the trees. And once chosen, you never really leave. I didn't sleep for 3 nights after that. Not because I was afraid, though fear coiled in my gut like a sleeping serpent, but because I was listening. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the old pipes, every rustle of Juniper shifting in her sleep became a potential signal. I kept the lights on, not out of comfort, but as a kind of defiance. If it wanted to stand in the corner of my room, then it would have to do so in full view. But it never appeared again. Not in that form, at least. Instead, it began to speak through the world around me. It started with the radio. I'd left it tuned to a classical station, something soft and wordless to fill the silence. But one evening, as I washed dishes, the music cut out abruptly. In its place came a voice, low, genderless, layered with static, whispering a single phrase over and over: You remember the roots. I yanked the plug from the wall. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Then came the dreams, not of forests or basements, but of my childhood bedroom. Only now, the walls were lined with photographs I'd never seen, images of other children, all standing at the edge of the same woods, all with the same hollow look in their eyes. Some wore clothes from decades past, pinafores, knickerbockers, wool caps. Others looked modern, like they could have been my classmates. And in every single photo, just behind them, barely visible between the trees, stood the figure. Watching. Waiting. One face in particular kept returning, a boy with freckles and a crooked smile, wearing a Wexford Elementary t-shirt from the 1980s. His name came to me in a dream not as a memory, but as a fact, Milo Hargrove. I looked him up the next morning. His obituary was brief. Died at age 9. Cause? Accidental drowning in Miller's Creek. But the date? It was October 31st, 1983. The same day the town's annual harvest walk was held in the woods behind Hemlock Lane. I dug deeper. Found another name, Lila Chin, 12 years old, vanished in 1992 during a school nature hike. Declared missing, presumed dead. Then Thomas Reed, 8, found unconscious near the old quarry in 2000, revived, but never spoke again. He moved away with his family a month later. All of them had lived within a mile of our house. All of them had disappeared or died in late October. All of them had been dreamers, according to old school records, children who lived in their imaginations, who preferred solitude, who spoke of things no one else could see. Just like me. The realization settled over me like frost. I hadn't been haunted by a random nightmare. I'd been chosen. Not cursed, chosen. As if the land itself had reached into the stream of time and plucked out certain children, those sensitive enough to hear its whisper, to feel its pulse beneath the soil. And the figure, it wasn't a monster. It was a guardian, or a warden, or perhaps both. It didn't want to hurt me. It wanted me to remember, to witness, to carry the weight of what had happened in those woods long before I was born. One rainy afternoon, I returned to the library downtown and requested access to microfilm archives of the Wexford Gazette from the 1950s. The librarian, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers, raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he loaded the reel. What I found chilled me to the bone. In October of 1957, a local farmer reported strange lights in the woods near Hemlock Lane. Children in the area began sleepwalking, some found miles from home, barefoot and dazed, speaking in languages they'd never learned. A schoolteacher wrote a letter to the editor describing a presence in the trees that does not belong to this world, yet has always been here. The town held a meeting, decided it was mass hysteria, burned a patch of the forest as a sanitation measure. But the dreams didn't stop. They only went underground, passed from child to child like a secret inheritance. I sat there for hours, scrolling through decades of quiet disappearances, unexplained illnesses, sudden silences. Always in autumn, always near the woods, always involving a child who heard too much or saw too clearly. That night I dreamed of Milo. He stood at the edge of the creek, water swirling around his ankles, holding out his hand. "It's not yours to run from," he said. His voice was calm, almost kind. "It's yours to hold." When I woke, there was mud on my socks. I hadn't left the apartment, but the mud was real, damp, dark, smelling of creek water and decaying leaves. I knew then what I had to do. Not to fight it, not to flee, but to face it, not as a victim, but as a witness. I packed a small bag, a flashlight, a notebook, a thermos of strong coffee, and the leather journal I'd foolishly thrown away but later retrieved from the trash. I left a note for my neighbor to feed Juniper. Then I boarded the evening train back to Wexford. This time, I didn't go to the house. I went straight to the woods. The path was overgrown, nearly swallowed by brambles and saplings, but I remembered the way. Every twist, every root, every stone. The air grew colder the deeper I walked, though it was only early November. The trees leaned inward, their branches knitting together overhead like cathedral arches. And then I saw it, the clearing. It wasn't on any map, but I'd seen it in my dreams 100 times. A circle of bare earth, ringed by ancient oaks, their trunks scarred with symbols matching the one in the basement. In the center stood a single, gnarled elm, its bark split in places, revealing wood as pale as bone. I stepped into the circle. The wind died instantly. The birds fell silent. Even the rustle of my own clothes seemed muffled, as if the world had drawn a breath and held it. Then, from the shadows between the trees, it emerged. The figure. But it was different now. Less threatening. Its limbs still too long, its face still smooth, but its posture was open, almost expectant. It didn't approach. It simply stood, waiting. I took a deep breath and opened the journal. "I remember," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "I remember Milo, Lila, Thomas, all of them." The figure tilted its head. "And I remember you," I continued. "You're not here to take. You're here to remind, to keep the memory alive." A long pause. Then, slowly, it raised one hand, not to reach for me, but to point toward the elm tree. I walked forward. At the base of the trunk, half buried in leaves, was a small wooden box, bound with rusted wire. My fingers fumbled as I pried it open. Inside lay a collection of objects: a tarnished locket, a child's marble, a dried wildflower, a pencil stub, and a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. I unfolded it carefully. Dozens of them, written in different hands, different inks, different eras. At the bottom, in fresh ink that hadn't even fully dried, was my name, Iloan. Tears blurred my vision. Not from fear, but from understanding. This wasn't a curse. It was a lineage, a silent pact between the land and those who could hear its voice. I added my own entry to the journal that night, sitting beneath the elm with the wind finally returning, whispering through the branches like a lullaby. I wrote of my dreams, my fears, my return. And at the end I wrote, "I will remember, and I will tell." When I left the woods at dawn, the figure was gone. But the weight in my chest had lifted, replaced by something quieter, steadier. Purpose. Back in Pittsburgh, I began writing. Not just for myself, but for all of them. For Milo, who loved frogs and hated carrots. For Lila, who could solve a Rubik's Cube in under a minute. For Thomas, who drew dragons in the margins of his math homework. I posted the stories online, anonymously at first. Then, as others began to respond, people from Wexford, from neighboring towns, even from other states, sharing their own childhood nightmares, their own autumn terrors, I realized something. The woods weren't the only place this happened. There are places like this everywhere. Old places. Quiet places. Places where the veil between dream and memory is thin. And the figures? They're not demons. They're keepers. They choose the sensitive ones, the dreamers, the listeners, the ones who feel the world too deeply and ask only one thing in return: remember us. Now, when I wake at 2:17 a.m., I don't reach for the light. I sit up, pour a cup of tea, and listen. Sometimes I hear tapping. Sometimes I see a shadow move at the edge of the room. But I'm not afraid anymore. Because I know now that some nightmares aren't meant to be escaped. They're meant to be honored. And as long as I remember, as long as I tell the stories, the children in the photographs won't be forgotten. The woods will keep breathing. And the figure, it will keep watching. Not with hunger, but with hope. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, Pittsburgh was wrapped in a hush of snow, the kind that muffles footsteps and turns streetlights into halos. I kept my apartment warm, but not too warm, just enough to keep the chill from settling in my bones. Juniper had returned to my lap, her purr a steady rhythm against the silence. She no longer hissed at shadows. Perhaps she sensed the shift in me, the quiet acceptance that had taken root where fear once grew. I continued writing. Not just the stories of Milo, Lila, and Thomas, but others too. Names sent to me by strangers who'd read my posts and recognized something familiar in the details. The tapping, the faceless watcher, the dreams that bled into waking life. A woman from Vermont wrote about her brother who vanished during a school camping trip in 1978, last seen staring into the trees, murmuring, "It's singing." A man in Oregon described how, as a boy, he'd drawn the same symbol, the circle with 3 lines, over and over in his notebooks, though he'd never seen it before. Each message felt like a thread pulled from the same ancient fabric. I compiled them into a digital archive, giving each child a page, a voice, a place to be remembered. I called it The Watched. No explanation, no sensationalism, just names, dates, fragments of lives interrupted by something older than memory. Then, one afternoon in December, an envelope arrived. No return address. Just my name, written in careful, looping script on thick, cream-colored paper. Inside was a single sheet, equally fine, bearing only a few lines. Asterisk, "You have done well, Eloan. The roots are grateful. Come home when the leaves return." Beneath it was a pressed leaf, not from an elm, but from a sycamore, its veins still faintly red. I knew, without doubt, who or what had sent it. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Instead, I placed the leaf between the pages of the journal, right beside my own entry. A bookmark. A promise. The holidays passed quietly. I visited my mother for Christmas. She lived now in a sunlit condo near Eerie, far from the woods and the memories they held. She asked how I was sleeping. I told her, better. She didn't press. But over dinner, she mentioned, almost casually, that she'd dreamed of our old house recently. It looked whole again, she said, stirring her tea, like someone had been taking care of it. I said nothing, but I wondered if the figure walked those halls now, not as a specter, but as a caretaker. January brought ice storms and power outages. During one long night without electricity, I lit candles and read aloud from the journal, my own words and those of the others. Juniper curled at my feet, eyes half closed, as if listening. And for the first time, I felt not haunted, but accompanied. Then, in late February, I received a call from the Wexford Historical Society. A woman named Dr. Arden Voss introduced herself as their archivist. She'd come across my online project and recognized several of the names I'd listed. "We've been trying to document local disappearances for years," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "But families rarely speak of them. There's a silence around certain events." She asked if I'd be willing to share my research. I agreed, on one condition: that the children's stories be told with dignity, not as mysteries to be solved, but as lives to be honored. She agreed without hesitation. We met in person in early March, just as the first crocuses pushed through the thawing earth. Dr. Voss was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a neat bun and eyes that held the quiet weight of someone who'd spent decades listening to the past. Over coffee in a small cafe near the town square, she slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were photographs I'd never seen. Not just of the missing children, but of the woods. Aerial shots from the 1940s showed a clear boundary, a perfect circle of trees, distinct from the surrounding forest. Soil samples from the 1960s revealed mineral compositions unlike anything in the region. And most telling of all, a land deed from 1723 written in faded ink, describing the parcel as set apart for the keeping of quiet things. No explanation, no elaboration, just those words. We sat in silence for a long moment. "Do you believe it's supernatural?" she finally asked. I shook my head. "I don't think it fits in that box. It's not ghost or demon or spirit. It's older than those words. It's part of the land, like a river or a mountain. It doesn't think like we do. It simply is. And it chooses certain people to remember it." She nodded slowly. "My grandmother used to say the woods had ears. That if you spoke kindly to the trees, they'd keep you safe. If you lied, they'd know." We began working together after that. I shared everything. The journal, the dreams, the names. She opened the society's archives to me. Together, we built a physical exhibit in the old town hall. A quiet room with soft lighting, wooden panels etched with names, and a central display featuring the journal, the wooden box, and a single, living elm sapling in a ceramic pot. We called it the Remembered. Opening night was on the first day of spring. Dozens came, locals, historians, a few families who'd lost children decades ago. Some wept. Some stood in silence. A woman in her 80s touched the name Milo Hargrove and whispered, "I was his babysitter. He used to say the trees talked to him at night." I stood in the back, watching, heart full. Afterward, Dr. Voss pulled me aside. "There's one more thing," she said. She led me to a locked cabinet and unlocked it with a brass key. Inside was a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a mask, carved from pale wood, smooth and featureless, just like the face of the figure in my dreams. But along the edges, tiny symbols were etched, some matching the ones in the basement, others unfamiliar. "It was found in the woods in 1931, she said softly. "Wrapped in burlap, buried beneath a stone cairn. The sheriff's report called it a child's toy. But no child claimed it. It's been in storage ever since." I reached out but didn't touch it. "It's not a toy," I said. "It's a vessel." She looked at me, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You've seen it wear something like this." I nodded. That night, I stayed in Wexford. I rented a room above the old bookstore, its windows overlooking the town square. Just before bed, I stepped onto the small balcony. The air was cool, scented with damp earth and new growth. And there, at the far end of the street, beneath the skeletal branches of a bare oak, stood the figure. Not threatening, not looming, just present. It raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or a blessing. Then it turned and walked into the woods. I didn't follow. I didn't need to, because I knew now that the connection wasn't broken by distance. It was woven into my bones, my breath, my dreams. I would carry it always, not as a burden, but as a thread tying me to something vast and ancient and deeply human. Back in Pittsburgh, I planted the sycamore leaf in a small pot on my windowsill. Within weeks, a green shoot emerged. I named it Milo. Spring deepened into summer. The archive grew. More people came forward. A podcast producer reached out, wanting to adapt the stories. Respectfully, she promised. I agreed, but insisted on final approval of every script. And every night, before I sleep, I open the journal and add a line. Sometimes it's a name. Sometimes a memory. Sometimes just, I remember. Because that's the pact. That's the purpose. The nightmare didn't end. It transformed. And in its place grew something quieter, stronger, a duty wrapped in tenderness, a vigil kept not in fear, but in love. Now, when the wind blows through the open window, I don't flinch. I listen. And sometimes, just sometimes, I whisper BAC. By midsummer, the sapling on my windowsill had grown 6 inches tall, its leaves broad and veined with the same faint red I'd seen in the pressed leaf from the anonymous letter. I watered it every morning, speaking to it in soft tones, sometimes recounting a new name I'd received, sometimes just sharing the weather or the sound of juniper chasing a sunbeam across the floor. It felt less like tending a plant and more like keeping a promise. The podcast launched in July. We called it The Watched Voices from the Edge of the Woods. Each episode focused on one child, blending archival audio, interviews with surviving relatives when possible, and ambient sounds recorded in Wexford's forests. The first episode, about Milo, ended with the gentle babble of Miller's Creek and a single line from his sister, now in her 50s. He always said the trees knew his name. I think maybe they still do. Within weeks, the show climbed the charts. Not because it was frightening, but because it was tender. Listeners wrote in saying they'd cried, not from fear, but from recognition, that ache of remembering a dream they'd long dismissed, a childhood feeling they'd buried. One message stood out: I thought I was broken for seeing things. Now I wonder if I was just chosen. I read that aloud to the sapling. It swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. In August, Dr. Voss invited me back to Wexford for the annual Harvest Walk, a tradition revived after decades of absence. This time, it wasn't just a festival with apple cider and hayrides. It was a ceremony of remembrance. They'd built a small stone circle in the clearing, modeled after the one I'd described. At its center stood a new elm sapling, donated by a local nursery, its roots wrapped in soil from the original site. Families of the missing children were invited to place tokens at its base: a toy soldier, a hair ribbon, a handwritten poem. I brought the wooden box. Under the golden light of late afternoon, I knelt and emptied its contents onto the earth. The locket, the marble, the pencil stub, they nestled into the soil like seeds. Then I placed the journal beside them, open to the final page where I'd written, "We are not forgotten. We are held." As the sun dipped below the tree-line, someone began to hum, a wordless, ancient-sounding tune. Others joined, softly at first, then stronger, until the clearing filled with a harmony that seemed to rise from the ground itself. I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see the figure as a silhouette of fear. I felt it as a presence, vast, patient, woven into the rustle of leaves, the coolness of stone, the breath of the wind. It wasn't separate from the land. It was the land. And we, the dreamers, were its memory keepers. That night, I stayed in the town's only bed and breakfast, a converted Victorian with creaky floors and lace curtains. I slept deeply, without dreams. But when I woke at dawn, there was a single sycamore leaf on my pillow. Fresh, green, veined with red. I pressed it into the back of the journal, where the pages were still blank, waiting. Back in Pittsburgh, I began writing a book. Not fiction, not horror. A quiet testament, a weaving of history, memory, and something older than both. My editor, initially skeptical, grew quiet after reading the first chapter. "This isn't just a story," she said. "It's a sanctuary." I liked that. As autumn returned, so did the tapping. But now it came not in fear, but in rhythm. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more, like a heartbeat. I'd answer by placing my palm flat against the wall, as if returning a pulse. Juniper no longer hissed. She'd sit beside me, tail curled around her paws, ears pricked forward, as if listening to a conversation just beyond human hearing. One evening in October, as I prepared for the anniversary of my first nightmare, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden carving, a figure, smooth-faced, arms outstretched, cradling a tiny, detailed tree. Tucked beneath it was a note. Asterisk, for the next keeper. I placed it on my desk beside the growing sapling. That night, I dreamed not of forests or basements, but of a long line of people stretching back through time. Farmers, teachers, children, elders, all standing beneath different trees, in different lands, all holding journals, masks, carvings, or simply their hands pressed to the earth. And between them, flowing like a river, was a single thread of awareness. Asterisk remember. Witness. Hold. Asterisk. I woke with tears on my cheeks, not from sorrow, but from belonging. The nightmare had never been mine alone. It was a lineage, a covenant, a quiet, enduring act of love for those who slipped between the worlds and were never truly seen. Now, when strangers message me, shaking, confused, saying they've seen the figure or heard the tapping, I don't offer reassurance that it's just a dream. I say, tell me what it showed you. Tell me what you felt. You're not alone. And sometimes, after they share their story, they write back, it stopped watching me. But I still feel it, like a hand on my shoulder when I walk through the woods. That's when I know the pact has been accepted. The figure doesn't haunt. It initiates. And once you understand that, the fear dissolves into something far more profound. Responsibility wrapped in reverence. Last week, I visited the Wexford exhibit again. The elm sapling in the town hall had grown tall enough to brush the ceiling. Names now covered 3 walls. Dr. Voss told me enrollment in the local historical society had tripled. Teenagers came after school to help transcribe old letters. Grandparents brought grandchildren to point at names and say, "That was your great-uncle. He loved the woods." The silence had broken. Not with screams, but with stories. As I stood before the display, a little girl, no older than I was in 2007, tugged her mother's sleeve and pointed to the mask. "Who's that?" she whispered. Her mother hesitated, then knelt. "That's the Watcher," she said gently. "It doesn't hurt anyone. It just remembers." The girl nodded, as if she already knew. I smiled and walked away, heart full. Because the cycle isn't about fear. It's about continuity. And as long as there are dreamers who listen, who remember, who speak the names aloud, the woods will never be empty. The figure will never be alone. And neither will I. The first snow of the new year fell on a Thursday, soft, silent flakes that dusted the city like powdered sugar. I watched from my window as Pittsburgh softened under the white hush, streetlights casting long amber halos through the falling snow. Juniper sat beside me, her chin resting on my knee, eyes half closed in contentment. On the sill, the sycamore sapling, now nearly 2 feet tall, bore a single cluster of dried leaves that refused to fall, clinging stubbornly to their branches like tiny hands holding on. I'd just finished the final edits on the book. It would be published in the spring, titled The Watched, Remembering the Ones the Trees Knew. The publisher had wanted something flashier, something with haunting or curse in the title. But I refused. This wasn't a tale of terror. It was an act of reclamation, of dignity restored. That evening, as I packed a box of advance copies to send to Dr. Voss and a few families who'd shared their stories, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Just a photograph. It showed the clearing in Wexford. Snow blanketed the ground, but the stone circle stood clear, as if untouched by the storm. At its center, the elm sapling wore a delicate crown of frost, and leaning against its trunk was a smooth, pale mask, identical to the one in the Historical Society's collection. No caption, no explanation, but I knew. It hadn't been placed there by human hands. I stared at the image for a long time, breath fogging the screen. Then I saved it to a folder I'd labeled Signs. It joined dozens of others. A leaf on the pillow, mud on untouched socks, the sycamore leaf in the envelope, the carving on my desk. Not threats. Not warnings. Invitations. The next morning, I received an email from a university in Maine. A professor of folklore had read my work and invited me to speak at a symposium on non-human memory in American landscape traditions. I almost declined. Public speaking still made my palms sweat, but then I remembered Milo's crooked smile in that old photograph, Lila's Rubik's Cube, Thomas's silent dragons. They deserve to be heard in lecture halls, not just whispered about in nightmares. I accepted. The trip was scheduled for late February. As I packed, I tucked the wooden figure carving into my suitcase, wrapped in soft cloth. I didn't know why I brought it, only that it felt right, like carrying a piece of the pact with me. Maine was colder than Pittsburgh, the air sharp with salt and pine. The campus nestled between frozen lakes and dense forests that looked eerily familiar, the same kind of quiet, watchful woods I'd known in Wexford. During my talk, I didn't recite facts or theories. I told stories. I spoke of children who listen too closely, of lands that remember, of figures that aren't monsters but mourners. Afterward, a young woman approached, eyes red-rimmed. "My brother disappeared in the White Mountains when I was 8, she said quietly. He used to draw circles with 3 lines in the dirt. We thought it was just a game." I handed her a copy of the book. "His name belongs here," I said. She nodded, clutching it like a lifeline. That night, in my hotel room, I dreamed of a vast network of routes stretching beneath the continent, connecting Wexford to the White Mountains, to the redwoods of California, to the swamps of Louisiana. Along those routes moved whispers, names, memories. And at every junction stood a watcher, faceless, timeless, waiting for the next listener to arrive. I woke with a certainty that settled deep in my bones. This wasn't just about one town. It was about a pattern woven into the fabric of the land itself. Back home, I began a new project. Not just an archive, but a map. Using submissions from listeners and readers, I plotted locations where similar phenomena had occurred, always near old growth, always tied to children who knew too much. The clusters formed a web across the country, densest in the Northeast and Appalachia, but present even in the desert Southwest and the Pacific Northwest. Each pin on the map wasn't a haunting. It was a sanctuary. In March, as crocuses pushed through the thawing earth once more, I returned to Wexford for the unveiling of a permanent memorial in the town square. Carved from local stone, it bore no names, only the symbol, a circle with 3 intersecting lines. Beneath it, in small, simple letters, read, "Asterisk for those who listened, for those who were taken, for those who remember, asterisk." Dozens gathered. Some brought flowers. Others stood in silence. A boy, maybe 10 years old, stepped forward and placed a smooth river stone at the base. He didn't say a word. He just looked at the woods and nodded, as if answering a question only he could hear. Dr. Voss touched my arm. "He's one of them, isn't he?" I watched the boy walk back to his mother, his steps light, his gaze steady. "Yes," I said, "but he won't be afraid. Not if we keep telling the truth." That evening, I walked alone to the clearing. The snow was gone, replaced by damp earth and the first green shoots of spring. The elm sapling had grown another foot. The mask was still there, nestled in the roots, half buried now, as if the tree were slowly reclaiming it. I sat cross-legged before it and opened my journal to a fresh page. "I'm still here," I wrote, "and I'm teaching others to listen." As I closed the book, a breeze stirred the branches above. Not cold, not threatening, just present. And in that moment I felt it, not as a separate entity, but as a part of the air, the soil, the pulse of the world itself. It wasn't watching me anymore. We were watching together. Spring deepened. The book launched to quiet acclaim, not bestseller lists, but steady, heartfelt reviews from readers who said it helped them understand their own childhood terrors. A therapist in Oregon began using excerpts in sessions with sensitive children. A school in Vermont started a listening circle where students shared dreams and stories without judgment. The nightmare had become a bridge. One afternoon in May, I received a call from the county records office in Wexford. The old house on Hemlock Lane, long abandoned, long decaying, had been purchased by an anonymous donor and donated to the Historical Society. They planned to restore it not as a museum of horror, but as a center for ecological memory and intergenerational storytelling. They want you to advise on the design, the clerk said. Especially the basement. I laughed softly. Tell them to leave the symbol on the floor. But add a window. Let the light in. That night, I dreamed of the house as it would be, sunlit rooms filled with children's drawings, shelves lined with journals from across the country, the basement transformed into a quiet reading nook with a skylight above the old chair. And in the corner, not a rope, but a small tree growing through a hole in the concrete, its leaves brushing the ceiling. When I woke, Juniper was staring at the door. Not hissing, not growling, just watching. I got up, walked to the door, and opened it. The hallway was empty, but on the floor, just outside my threshold, lay a single sycamore leaf, fresh, green, veined with red. I picked it up, pressed it to my chest for a moment, then placed it in the journal beside the others. The cycle continues, not with fear, but with faith. And as long as there are those who listen, who remember, who dare to speak the names of the lost, not as victims, but as witnesses, the woods will never fall silent. The figure will never be alone. And neither will we. For weeks after that, everything felt peaceful. The book tours slowed. The messages grew fewer. Even the tapping stopped. I told myself it was because the work was done, that the remembering had quieted whatever ancient presence lingered in the edges of my world. Juniper slept soundly through the night. The sycamore sapling thrived. Spring bloomed without incident. I began to believe it was over. Then, on the first night of June, I woke to silence. Not the usual quiet of a city at rest, but a deep, hollow absence, as if the world had been wrapped in thick wool. No hum of the refrigerator. No distant sirens. Not even the rustle of leaves outside. Just nothing. I sat up slowly. Juniper wasn't on the bed. Her food bowl, usually empty by morning, was full. Untouched. I called her name. My voice didn't echo. It vanished, swallowed by the stillness. That's when I noticed the journal was open on the nightstand. I hadn't left it open. And the page, it wasn't one I'd written. The handwriting was mine. Every curve, every slant identical, but the words were wrong. I tried to keep you safe by remembering them, it read. Asterisk, but it doesn't want their names. It wants yours. Beneath that, in smaller script, asterisk, you were never the witness. You were the offering. My breath caught. I flipped back through the pages. Every entry I'd written about Milo, Lila, Thomas was gone. In their place were only dates. My dates. October 29th, 2007. Asterisk, it saw me. November 2nd, 2007. Asterisk, it chose me. March 15th, 2025. Asterisk, it waited. And at the very bottom of the last page, fresh ink still glistening. Asterisk, tonight it takes. I dropped the journal like it had burned me. Staggered to the window. The street below was empty. No cars. No lights. Even the street lamp was dark. But the woods, far beyond the city skyline, miles away in Wexford, seemed to pulse with a faint, grayish glow, like moonlight seen through fog. Then I heard it. Not tapping. Breathing. Slow. Wet. Close. From the corner of the room, the same corner where it had stood months ago, came a soft shifting sound, like fabric dragging over wood. I didn't turn. I couldn't. Because in the window's reflection, I saw it. Taller than before. Its limbs stretched too long, fingers brushing the ceiling. Its face, still smooth, still blank, but now tilted downward, as if studying the back of my neck. And around its neck hung dozens of small, leather cords. Each one held a name tag. Milo, Lila, Thomas. And at the very front, gleaming faintly in the dark, a new tag. Unmarked. Waiting. I tried to scream, but my mouth wouldn't open. My lungs wouldn't fill. It wasn't fear that held me, it was recognition. The truth slithered into my mind, cold and final. The stories weren't to honor the lost. They were bait. Every name I spoke, every memory I revived, every listener I comforted, it wasn't healing the past. It was feeding the present. And now that I gathered enough voices, it was time to collect the keeper. The breathing grew louder, closer. A hand, long, pale, impossibly cold, rested gently on my shoulder. Not to harm, to claim. Outside, the first light of dawn began to bleed across the sky. But in my room, the shadows deepened. And as the world woke up around me, I felt myself being pulled backward, not into sleep, not into death, but into the quiet between seconds, into the hush beneath roots, into the place where all the watched ones go. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed over my eyes was the sycamore sapling on the windowsill. Its leaves were gone. Its branches were bare. And wrapped around its trunk, like a vine, was a thin, pale rope. And used, waiting for the next one who listens too closely to the wind.